Okay, folks, why don't we get started with the second panel? I have three papers and two discussants for this panel. And the first paper will be by Lee Alston, Marie Duggan, and Julio Ramos Pastrana, and the title of which is The Spanish Mission Legacy on Native American Reservations in the Southwest and California.
Okay, well, first I want to thank the organizers for the invitation to present this work. We're really welcoming feedback. So as I mentioned, Jeff mentioned, this is joint with Marie Duggan and Julio Ramos, and they're both on board here. So this is about the impact of the Spanish missions, and that I'll clarify what that means because there were several episodes outside of the Spanish mission period. So this is a nice picture of a mission that my wife took. And what I want to clarify, though, is this is a mission church. This is not a mission. A mission is a broader, larger community whose central focus was, of course, Catholicism and the mission. But it was much more than that. It was people living next to one another. Sometimes the mission church abutted a pueblo. Other times, Native Americans just surrounded and lived within the mission itself. So this is really important for the hypothesis that we want to develop later on. So the research question is, what was the impact, the socioeconomic impact of the Franciscan missions founded by Spain between 1598 and 1810 on Native Americans in these three states in the Southwest? And surprisingly, there's been little quantitative work on this. So we really need to set the stage here. The Spanish arrived in New Mexico in 1598. Okay, so almost 100 years before they got involved in Arizona, and considerably longer than that before they got involved in California. And there's a lot of misconceptions about Native Americans and slavery and so on. Yes, indeed, it happened, but it didn't happen in general to baptize Native Americans. Okay, so those non-baptized so-called heathens who were not baptized were fair game to enslave, and that did occur in these areas as well to a certain extent. It was also the case that the Spanish had a very different policy with respect to Native Americans than the British or the US or the Canadians, in that they were tied to the land and they weren't pushed aside. I'll come back to that a little bit. And they didn't end up in Oklahoma, for example. And they had certain rights within Spanish imperialism, one of which was that they could go to court, and they did. And importantly, I've mentioned this importance about the baptized Indians. That came about during Spain's edicts of laws of the Indies. In 1680, they granted baptized Indians legal rights to land and that they couldn't be enslaved. And subsequent to the Spanish, after the Mexican Revolution, both Mexico and the US recognized the land rights of Native Americans in law, but not always in practice. But some cases they did, and this varied across our three states. We're going to categorize the settlement of this area into four periods. The first was 1598 to 1680. And here, the motive of the missionaries is what we call top-down Catholicism. They wanted to prevent Native Americans from practicing their traditional religious ceremonies. They wanted them to whole hog adopt Catholicism. They also impressed them into labor in terms of building churches, buildings for governors, and so on. So this was the motive of the missionaries was pretty much about Catholicism. The motives of the settlers, governors, and the military was profit. That was some mining, that was some trade. In some cases, it involved enslaving Native Americans, in particular Apaches at times. And so this coercion And the prohibition of Native American practices alienated a lot of the Pueblo tribes. And at this point, the missions were only in New Mexico. They hadn't gotten to Arizona or California yet. And this led to a revolt called the Pueblo Revolt. And this was an amazing accomplishment, actually, that the Spanish were kicked out of present-day New Mexico, kicked into Texas for 16 years. So this entailed a really incredible amount of organization across all these pueblos that they could all meet and gather at a certain time in order to go after the Spanish. And for the most part, it was in Santa Fe, but it was elsewhere as well. Anywhere near where they were having this revolt, but it all happened on the same time, same dates. And churches were burned, priests and settlers were killed. And it's important to notice that this was overall a rebellion. It was a rebellion against the church. It was a rebellion against the settlers. It was a rebellion against the governors. So this was, it was widespread. It wasn't that the churches were spared and so on. We'll come back to that because later on, the churches became more advocates for the Native Americans. And here's a picture of the guy who did the organization. And if you go to the Native American Museum in Washington, D.C., this is where you'll find that statue. And what he has tied around his waist there is a rope with knots on it. And this guy, Popeye, went around to all the different pueblos and gave him these belts with knots on it. And that was to count down the days until the rebellion would occur. And you can tell this is a pretty important event if this statue was erected in Washington, D.C. And you see this around New Mexico quite a bit. Okay, so the next period when the Spanish came back is what we call Catholicism Bottom-Up. So the missionaries accepted the Native American religion as long as they were baptized. So religion and practice was syncretic, so that people could have practices in kachinas, and the mission churches themselves took on a mix of icons and things that were much more sympathetic to Native American art and culture than the ones that the Spanish had before. And the missionaries increasingly saw their role as advocates, standing in between the military and the government. The military still wanted to land grab. A lot of settlers wanted to land grab. And the point I wanted to make before is that the missions were a congregation. Land and people were not really separable. And that's juxtaposed against this profit motive for the settlers and governors. And this is a long period of time. This is the period of time that we're going to be focusing on. So it's 114 years of Spanish mission experience. And this is what we're arguing would have a long-lasting impact. Because in the next period, when the Mexico took over, Mexico became independent in 1821. They expelled the Spanish-born, which in principle they said, but didn't follow through on it for the most part. But what is important is that there was secularization, and it was kind of different across our three states. In Arizona and New Mexico, it was really through neglect of any resources at all that the churches became secularized. So the idea was that, and the number of mission churches declined dramatically during the occupation of Mexico. And the idea was to turn these parish churches into serving both settlers and Native Americans. That's what we mean by a parish church. In California, it's a little bit different because there was a de jure secularization, and it included New Mexico and Arizona too, but it really had teeth in Arizona. And the idea there was that they would be taking land away from these mission congregations. So again, these missions were large tracts of land, sometimes, the sizes of counties, and settlers. California land was very fertile, and trade was very lucrative with the Far East, as well as going all the way around the Horn. That's why this was more of a big deal in California. And the Mexicans, though, unlike the Spanish, really tried to encourage settlement. And they gave relatively large land grants. And the guys who got these large land grants were ranchers, and they wanted the Native Americans living on them so they could use them as labor. They didn't want to evict them. They didn't want to move them off. They wanted to use them as laborers, and they paid them. And the missionaries actually sided oftentimes with the Native Americans in terms of how much they should get paid for these tasks that they did. And they tried to get mission communities title to land. That was not, for the most part, terribly successful. And then there was the Mexican-American War, which culminated in 1848 with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. With the U.S. will respect the extant property rights granted by Spain and Mexico. Now, that was subject to some interpretation. In the case of New Mexico, they codified and recognized the Pueblo tracts of land that they had held for centuries prior to the Spanish coming in. But the U.S. settlers really coveted the land of Mexican, ex-Mexican, but Mexican ranchers and Native Americans. And where the U.S. immigrants are most numerous, Native Americans had the least rights. And the U.S. government put bounties on the heads of Native Americans in Northern California near the gold fields. It was also the case that the U.S. government said Native Americans could not apply for homesteads. And so there was this tension, particularly in California, between the existing Mexican ranchers who wanted the ex-mission Indians as labor and the incoming U.S. immigrants who wanted to displace Native people from their land and also wanted to encroach on these Spanish land grants. For the most part, they weren't able to encroach on the Spanish land grants, but in the north, they were able to displace Native Americans from their land. What was also different, the U.S. fostered this policy of assimilation, which in some ways, I was thinking about it this morning, was a bit what the first Spanish settlement wanted to do with their top-down Catholicism. So here, the U.S. government wanted assimilation. They wanted them to be settled down, practice agriculture, and so on and so forth. Again, I've mentioned that the Pueblo tribes were different in New Mexico. They were able to hold on to their lands. Now, Native Americans in California were frequently separated from their ancestral lands, but they weren't moved to Oklahoma. As they said, they were moved to the rocks. So they were moved eastward. So they were close to what they would consider their ancestral lands. They weren't thousands of miles away. They were maybe 40 miles away. There was an important Supreme Court decision in 1873, and this was a big deal about assimilation and what kind of tribe it was. So peaceful tribes had rights to their land. Non-peaceful tribes, for example, the Apaches, did not have rights to their land for quite a long period of time. And at this period, the Apaches were still at war with the U.S. I just finished a biography of Geronimo, which was really quite fascinating. He didn't give up till the end. I'll give you the results and then flip through some of the regressions very, very quickly, and then conclude because I really want to save time for discussion. So we have data, and Brian Leonard's there. We need to thank Brian Leonard for lot of help in finding the data that we've used for our dependent variables. And we have outcome measures for Native Americans in the 3 states of California, Arizona, and New Mexico by the superintendency level, which is larger level than a reservation. But for the most part, these reservations were all very homogeneous in terms of whether or not they had mission contact. And what we find is that those that had contact with missions were considerably more Catholic. They had lower crime rates. They had higher income from agriculture, higher earnings overall, and no difference in education. And the education variable at first was surprising, given what somewhat was a motivation for getting involved in this project, which was this article by Waldinger in the Journal of Development Economics. And what she found was that the density of Franciscan missions had both a short run and very long run effect on educational outcomes. And it was true in 1895 when she measured, and it was also true in the present. And we found that there wasn't an effect. Here's our regression specification. We have data depending on the outcome measure for it. Sometimes it's throughout the period, sometimes it's not. So we've got the outcome measures that I've mentioned: Catholic, full blood, school-age children in school, crop income, earnings. You can see it there. And mission is just a dummy variable. And then we have a variety of control variables for superintendency and so on. Okay, I've got all these. Let me just give you the bottom line. Okay, so for Catholicism, if you had a mission contact, the percentage of Catholics increased by 224%. Another nice picture of a mission. Full-blooded, which we thought was kind of cultural solidarity to some extent, increased full blood by 13%. No effect on education. If schools are about assimilation, we're not sure how to actually interpret this. There's been recent results suggesting boarding schools in particular were quite abusive. Maybe not having any difference in education was a good thing, or at least not having more education. Here we can see that crop earnings were up 128%. Overall earnings on wages were up by 56%. Crimes, no difference in felonies, but reduced misdemeanors by 66% and reduced drunkenness by 125%. So these are big numbers. These are not marginal numbers that we're finding. So we need to be clear about what we're not saying. We're not saying that missions were the best thing that ever happened to Native Americans. Well, of course not. The demographic hit was huge, about 50% decline in population from when the Spanish first arrived to the end of the period. The point we are making is that after 1696, Catholicism became much more syncretic with a mixture of Native American beliefs and religious beliefs, and that the missionaries became advocates during the strong period after 1696 till 1810, advocates for the Native Americans. And what we find is, we get these relatively good outcomes, and this is consistent with missions creating a community that held certain social norms. And I'll just end with this quote that suggests the long sense of persistence here. So, 80 years after the Chumash uprising and long after the missions had been secularized, so on, as Holy Week approached, an Indian appeared and offered to act as a server for the Easter Mass. Slowly over the course of that week, Indians came in increasing numbers. The church, full at Easter, contained Indian singers who helped celebrate the Mass. The point is, they continued to celebrate the Mass even without parish priests present. And I'll just end with this nice picture of another mission church. And that's it.
Okay, thanks, Lee. So the second paper is by Eric Alston and Stephen Smith, The Comparative Effect of Federal and State Land Policy in the U.S. West.
I will be handing it off to my Colorado compatriot, and I suppose I'll call ourselves the Colorado contingent as opposed to the cartel, because I'm not sure what we're restraining the supply of, but hopefully we're producing ideas freely in competition. But we're examining one of the federal land policies that has received kind of less direct and explicit treatment in the wave of what I would maybe call new empirical scholarship from the econ history bench, examining the effects of land policy in the US West. So we're quite happy to have Brian Leonard giving us comments, because he's certainly among the people applying new empirical techniques to these questions. And so apologies for anyone who's read my blog post on Jeff's blog, but these National Archive pictures also appear on that blog. But to me, they do spell out visually the extent of development taking place as a function of federal land policy in the 19th century US West. So at the top there is a land survey camp. So surveying was kind of not a precondition to settlement, but certainly a precondition to settlers getting title from the federal government to their lands. And so in particular, it went from a process of surveying under the rectangular system that many scholars in this area are quite familiar with at this point, from surveying to the point below, a family that had successfully proven up their homestead in Arizona after 5 years of improvements. And so we certainly aren't the first to argue that this 19th century federal land policy was a major input to the development of the US West. Just to explore a few sources worth examining on that question, earlier names such as Hibbard, Robbins, and Gates, as well as Allen and Leonard's interesting recent piece about the persistent, and I would argue slightly puzzling, negative development effects associated with the Homestead Act in particular. Railroad land grants are also huge in terms of their influence, in terms of there being a question of interest to scholars, and in terms of the amount of lands that the grants to railroads operated to transfer to those companies at that period of time. So Fogel, as well as Robert Fogel, as well as Donaldson and Hornbeck more recently have said, hey, these had a non-trivial, but not stratospheric effect on development. But this was also subject to considerable regional variation, which is a contribution Stephen, my co-author, and I made recently in the Journal of Law and Econ, exploring the Northern Pacific Railroad grants in particular. Those Northern Pacific grants are also big on the map in terms of the states we consider in our analysis here. So I'll return to them briefly in a few slides. So the modern literature identifies persistent effects as a result of federal land policies, which poses an ongoing empirical question as to the variation in state treatment by these policies themselves. And we think one source of considerable variation in state treatment is the terms of state trust lands in particular. Finally, I think it's worth noting anytime you're talking about federal policy in the US West, that the treatment of Native Americans was, to me, terrible. Maybe less terrible in certain instances than others, but overwhelmingly negative compared to the stylized development narrative that you hear from predominantly the experiences of European settlers. And so to me, it's just an important footnote that warrants explicit mention in historical treatment of this period by the federal government and its land policies. But beyond just land, the institutions that the federal government set up to transfer land to private individuals or companies in the cases of railroads, other resources were central to economic development in the US West. Whether it be minerals under the ground, timber on top of it, or central to our analysis, water as an input to almost every activity, whether it be ranching, mining, or homesteading on a more individual scale. And this water, it actually enables interesting identification of effects of other institutions. And this is an insight that Stephen and I leverage in our railroad land grants work in particular, saying uncertainty to land title can be observed in terms of its effect on willingness to invest in costly irrigation development that was asset specific to the land in question. And so uncertainty in land title leads to less development in water in particular. And that's an identification strategy that we also leverage here, because the prior appropriation doctrine emerged in the US West to govern the disposition of a fundamentally scarce resource that I've already emphasized was a major input to economic activity in the first instance. And so in order to secure your right as against other junior users, as they were called, the seniority of your right was a function of the extent to which you filed prior in time to other appropriators. And you had to prove beneficial use of that water at the time of appropriation in order to secure your right. So individual participants' economic incentives were strongly aligned with filing as soon as they had a viable claim to that water, because that would determine their rights in times of scarcity as against other junior appropriators. And so we think that actually using the year of priority date of an irrigation water right is actually a great way to identify the rough time of settlement. There's issues with the patent process that may have subsided by the 1890s. Brian has done some good work in Oklahoma in particular on that question, but land patents prior to that were subject to quite a tortuous process in DC that I would argue makes pinning development as a function of the issuance of land patents from the federal land office more problematic than the relatively local nature in which economic incentives were directly aligned with appropriating water as against more junior users. And so the meat of our analysis surrounds another federal land policy that we think has received slightly less treatment in the modern empirical scholarship on this question: state trust lands. This is not a novel institution to the US West. It begins all the way back in 1785 with a land ordinance that partly emanated to figure out how to get land to soldiers who fought in the Revolutionary War. But it also settled other very important questions in terms of the public land survey system for lands further west that weren't already colonized, as well as set the precedent for the state trust lands that we're considering today. So the 1785 ordinance set aside lot 16 in every PLS township to support schools and other functions thought to be essentially local. The terms of the grants to states slowly changed as earlier states' terms revealed challenges. Leasing was viewed as a failure in Ohio, which transitioned to an option to sell those lands, which was also viewed as an abject failure, at least from the perspective of maximizing revenue to the state government, because those lands tended to transfer, at least in the anecdotal historical accounts of the time, well below market value to existing users of those lands. And so this is kind of a slow process of revelation of if the public policy purpose is to support local government's ability to fund local schools, maybe not putting any restrictions on sale price isn't the best way to achieve that outcome unless you're looking for a one-time transfer to local economic actors who possibly can dominate the local political economy. Again, that's anecdotal in several histories around the time period of the Ohio land grants. Stephen and I are looking at a much later period. But I do think it's illustrative of the reasons that the terms of state trust lands became both more specific over time, but also, interestingly, became more generous over time, in part due to the lower levels of economic development relative to the more settled over centuries eastern territories that became states. And so these operated at the time of a territory's accession to statehood. They operated to transfer specific sections of land to the fledgling state government to fund local purposes, especially schools. The major distinction at the top level is simply the number of sections granted, which mechanically determine the amounts of land per township that each state government received. And so between 1803 and 1858, it was section 16. Then it was two sections between 1859 and 1890. And this is the specific institutional terms that govern our chosen subsample of states. In total, nearly 100 million acres of land transferred to 29 states under these policies. So this is a non-trivial amount of land that eventually transferred to the states, especially New Mexico and Arizona, they got quite a bit of land under that final 4 sections per township wave of state trust institutions. And so initially, it seems like this might be a very interesting comparative empirical question. What did state trust lands do in the West? And Jeff may be chuckling because that was kind of the essence of our initial proposal. But as we dig into the question a bit more, and this is the fun of historical empirical work in general, it's like actually California getting 1 section all the way back in the 1850s versus New Mexico and Arizona getting 4 sections per township in 1912. How are we going to claim to control for all relevant variation? Probably not, we say. And so we actually identify a subset of states. One geographically massive set of states receives nearly identical institutional treatment due to their contemporaneous accession to statehood around 1890. So North Dakota, South Dakota, Montana, Washington, Idaho, and Wyoming all exceeded in 1889 or 1890. Due to some data issues in terms of the way that water rights are recorded on the state level in Wyoming and South Dakota, we don't treat those in our analysis here. But the rest of them, North Dakota, Montana, Washington, and Idaho, are the subject of our empirical analysis. Each of these states received sections 16 and 36, which is shown in the second image there, the second wave, 1859 to 1890. But what we want to emphasize as an additional historical detail of pretty central relevance to understanding the development of these states is that the Northern Pacific Railroad cut through most of these states at a massive level. It touched Wyoming, although much less so than Idaho, Washington, Montana, and North Dakota. So the railroad land grant meant the Northern Pacific received a considerable amount of the odd sections in these states. Each state received the same sections per township, and all, importantly, for the purposes of our comparative analysis, all received the same minimum sales price of $10 an acre, which was considerably higher than available federal lands, which would have been within the land grant $2.50 an acre for a cash sale. Outside the land grant, $1.25 an acre for a cash sale. And in either case, if you got it under a homestead claim, then you had to make 5 years of improvements, in which case you would get the patent for free or at a minimum at the cost of those improvements, which were non-trivial. And so our hypothesis is that these state trust lands, the specific institutional terms governing them, could have impeded development both directly as a function of relative prices, but additionally due to the political economic rent capture available at the state level. Finally, we think, given that the dominant classes of economic activity in a particular area are an input to the political economy that you see in that area, that it also, we anticipate variance as a function of share of economic activity in a given state dedicated to a particular output. And so on that note, I'll turn it over to my co-author, Stephen, to cover the empirical components.
Thanks, Eric. I anticipated you would take more than half, so I'll be able to deal with that anyways. So as Eric said, I want to talk about sort of the empirical side, which is going to test sort of the effect of having the state trust land. As far as the data, we're relying on a bunch of spatial data that we can georeference, both some of the resource use and ultimately the land use. And what's really nice about this application is we have the Bureau of Land Management's PLSS grid. I'm going to use the first division land units, which are the 640 acres that are often then divided into the quarters that you see under the Homestead Act. But in this case, the treatment is very much at this level, right? Those sections 16 and 36 are referring to one of these first division units. As Eric mentioned, we chose to sort of focus on that irrigation because we sort of have the benefit of both having really highly resolute spatial records from modern GIS records of where these irrigation continue to take place. But at the same time, thanks to the prior appropriation doctrine, we also have pretty good temporal precision. I mean, actually down to the month, sometimes the day, depending on the records of when this occurred. We're going to rely only on the year here, but it gives us some resolution of seeing when development happened in 1890 or 1896 versus some other sort of measures that we do utilize. The drawback, as he sort of mentioned, we're struggling this with Wyoming particularly, is the data is sort of inconsistent because this is a state level measure. rather than any sort of federal management, right? So the water in the West typically falls under state's jurisdiction, and hence whatever record keeper they have, state engineer, keeps their own records in their own way. So hopefully we've dealt with that and matched them pretty well. We did want to look at some other resources, and this is a little bit more of a stab to grab something. It's the Cropscape data, which gives us sort of more modern land use. It's national, at least starting since 2008, and that's the year we use because it's the most historic, although as a historian, I don't quite consider 2008 all that long ago, but it gives us a snapshot of maybe some long-term persistent effects to look at. The only thing I want to sort of highlight on our descriptive statistics is about 20% of these sections across our sample are irrigated. This overstates sort of what you might think of being irrigated because this is just a binary. Did this section have some irrigation? In the West, it's more around 10% of land actually being irrigated at this level. Beyond that, I did want to mention we've got the railroad grant stuff. As Eric mentioned, we've dealt with that in Montana specifically, but if he goes back one slide for me, you can see up in the top right, if we were just to compare sort of our even sections to odd, we might be sort of inflating that effect due to what was going on to the railroad lands. So our empirical test is relatively straightforward. We're leveraging the fact while these sections are certainly not random, in fact, it's sort of the opposite of random, it's very systematic within this grid, but it is exogenous, sort of conditional on the land resources and what might be available. The states aren't generally selecting in to better land, closer to sort of streams or other elements. And so they're randomly endowed with these natural resources. And so we sort of can rely on the fact, was this a state section? Was this numbered 16 or 36? And see how that development sort of varied. It is, if you're looking at this map, you can see sort of that pattern that Eric discussed, where California only has one. Our states, Montana, Idaho, and Washington, are receiving 2 of these sections. You see a little denser. And then, of course, New Mexico and Arizona. And Utah also received 4, but they have got a lot of federal lands as well. Right, a lot denser down there. But what you'd also see is this is very much an intent to treat, right? If these were already settled with homesteads or something else, they had the chance to select another unit of land. Later, when the national forest started coming in, there's some evidence of some land swaps happening. Although during the development of the irrigation, this was probably still in the state sort of hands. Mostly we're going to rely within township fixed effects. So we're going to be looking at these 6 by 6 square miles to take care of most covariates that might also explain some of this. But we also have a number of those covariates that are on the screen above, as far as distance to stream, strawler order, elevation, things that might also affect your decision to irrigate. So with that, we'll look at some of the results. So we'll highlight here in the first column, and probably panel B is where we should look, where we do have those township fixed effects. We do see that these areas are less likely to be irrigated. And we think part of this is because you did not own the land, and meanwhile, the state itself wasn't in the business of developing a lot of these irrigation projects themselves. We do see a decline, this 0.0137. It aligns to about a 6% reduction in the overall rate, which importantly shows that a lot of these state lands, or at least these 16 and 36 sections, were developed for irrigation, but they were less likely overall than sort of writ large the federal land or even the railroad lands that were available. We also see there is a delay in column 2. And then the more interesting, I think, when we look at some of these CDL outcomes through sort of column 3 through 6, is we also see lower developments. And this is sort of classification of low, high, and medium development by that land layer. And we see less cropland. But you see a little more uptick in sort of the passive use resource that you don't have to invest much in. That was sort of naturally there, but might be maintained in terms of the grass pasture and the forest share. If we go to the next slide, we do see some evidence that this might have to do with the state lands, simply because prior to 1890, when these state lands were sort of chopped off and given to the states, you didn't see this effect in irrigation when we look at the development at those times, but we saw that effect emerge and then grow going into the future. Since I only have one more minute, we'll jump to sort of these state-by-state results. We see a lot of heterogeneity, actually, when we break this up within states. We do see across the board sort of the effect in irrigation is lower. It's less likely, and although the coefficients are slightly different, it ends up being about 6% of the underlying irrigation rate in each state. But we see some other interesting patterns. Like in Washington, sort of drives the lack of development. There we see less grass and less cropland and a lot more forest versus down in Montana. We see, less cropland, but they seem to replace that with maintaining higher grass share. And what we found most interesting about these results is if you look at the dependent variable means, the largest effects that we find at the state seem to be for the states that have more land use in that sort of area. So for instance, looking at Montana's grass share of 0.46, right? They're the ones that we're seeing that change in grass share, whereas everyone else has quite a bit less land in that grass pasture. So we'll go to the discussion slide. I think we'll focus sort of on the bottom. We certainly think there's been an effect. I think getting into sort of the political economy a little bit more about which land uses are being driven by the vested interests that show up in each of those states, seeing that we do have some heterogeneity in that. As Eric alluded to, we think there's some interest in zooming out and seeing if we can see some more variation where states got various amounts of the land. And last, we just want to point out that even if it wasn't developed for irrigation, much like Brian's results on homesteading, initial development might be bad for later developments. In these cases, it doesn't mean that this is a bad outcome. These state lands that have more forest, a lot of the revenue comes from forest timber in Washington, renting or leasing pasture land, right, for grassland. So these can generate revenue in a passive way. And then also in more modern times where recreation is valued, might have additional reversal of fortune. So I think we're against the clock, so I'll just wrap it up at that.
Thanks, Eric and Stephen. We have a third paper on this larger second panel, and that is from a team at Claremont Graduate University, Gene Schradel, Joseph Dietrich, and Melissa Rogers. Inequalities in vote by mail in the U.S. West, origins and current realities of U.S. mail access for Native Americans in Arizona.
I'm presenting work, as you introduced us, co-authored work with Gene Schradel, who's on the call, as well as Dr. Joseph Dietrich, Dr. Schradel and Dr. Dietrich, both colleagues at Claremont Graduate University. And it's part of a broader project oriented around work by specifically by Dr. Schradel and others at Claremont, working on Native American voting access, and especially in the West. And so the work we're showing today is about documenting the historical sources of inequities in access to post offices. In particular, we're studying this in northeastern Arizona and around the Navajo reservation. And as I'll describe it, the motivation for this is really about the increase in vote by mail, especially in the U.S. West. And it's being seen as really a voting equity reform, and in many cases it is. But Native Americans, particularly those on reservations, are some of those for whom that voting reform may not benefit tremendously, and documenting some of the reasons why those that voting and vote by mail might be particularly challenging for Native Americans on reservations. And this part of this project is showing that the history of the post office is one that was not based around extending voting rights, right? And so there are documented, as we're going to show you, documented inequities in voting and mail access to Native Americans or those on reservations versus other rural populations in Arizona. And that unequal access to mail is really going to be something that's going to drive differences in access to voting. Now that vote by mail is the dominant way that people cast a ballot, especially in the West. So our motivation is that that vote by mail is how most of us vote these days, in particular in the West. If you think about the reforms to go to fully vote by mail, most of these are in the West, right? So think of Washington, think of Colorado. As a California voter, right, most of us vote by mail. And in Arizona, you have the option to be on the permanent mail voter list, and a very large percentage of Arizonans take advantage of this. In other work we have done, particularly Dr. Schradel and Dr. Dietrich, they've shown that Native Americans have very low rates of voting. This is well documented in the literature as well as very low trust in vote by mail in particular. And we think some of what we're doing in this paper is showing why there's less trust in voting in the mail system and voting by mail in particular amongst Native American communities. And something that's really important to our study and thinking about mail access on reservations is that Native Americans on reservations have typically what's called non-standard mail service. This means that if you want to receive or send letters, you need to go to the post office itself. And when we think about the reservations in northeastern Arizona, as well as other parts of the West, Nevada and other places, these are very, very remote locations. And driving to a post office, assuming you have a car, is a full day activity. We're talking sometimes 100 or more miles one way. And so our question is, what are the historical sources of unequal mail service for people on reservations that we're going to document? And does that mail service impact voting? So the overview is that we find in our we're really focused on the history of the post office and the placement of post office in this analysis. And we find that 89% of all current Northeast Arizona post offices were in place before 1920. Right. So the reason why we focus on this is because the logic of why those post offices were placed at the time is really not about anything having to do with equity, right? It's for both military and economic reasons, as I'm going to explain. And so the fact that you have most of your post offices placed before 1920 on these logics means that there's not going to be equitable access to the mail service for people on reservations versus others. So post offices are located were located prior to 1920 based on two big constituencies. The first was for military outposts, and those military outposts had the objective of pacification of native populations, right? So something described in several of the other papers. The other thing, and this has not been a big part of the literature, but it was in part established to provide economic support for white settlers, mostly in agriculture. And many of these settlers, even most of these settlers, were from the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or the Mormon population, right? And especially the expansion out of southern Utah and other places of the Mormon population into other agricultural territories. So postal service was not determined by considerations of equity, but for economic services. And as I'm going to describe later, there was some degree of exploitation of Native people based on these on around the post office itself that likely shapes things like trust in the postal service. So it's not postal access is not equitable across individuals. And this is really important, but it's not even equitable across individuals and similarly rural locations, right? So our comparison group is predominantly rural locations that are not on reservations. So what we show is that rural precincts have much lower rates of vote by mail than other rural communities, corresponding to less postal access. And something that's not in the paper, but I'm going to show today too, is that in places where there is higher postal access on reservations, you do see higher vote by mail rates. Right, showing that the part of this is really about, or a big part of this is really about access to mail and the proximity to mail services. So our contribution as we see them is really a political economy focus on the political economy of the placement of post offices, as well as historical analysis from primary sources, right? So we especially my colleague, Dr. Shodell, really did a deep dive into the historical locations of these post office, why they were placed there. We have data on things like the population and the pay for those at these early post offices. It's not perfect data but it's interesting stuff. And then we locate and match historical and current post offices which is a non-trivial activity. I know my colleague, especially Dr. Deter, can talk about how it's really hard to figure out where post offices are even today and their hours and when they're being serviced in these really rural places. And we have data collection and data analysis in a traditionally qualitative focused research area, which is Native American voting rights in particular. Okay, so overview of how to understand accessing mail in northeastern Arizona. So again, it's non-standard mail service. And this means that mail does not come to your house. This means that you cannot send mail from your house, that you have to go to a post office. You have to usually have a PO box to get anything like reliable mail. That means you have to pay to have a PO box to have anything like reliable mail. Because otherwise you have to ask the postmaster for your mail and they tend to throw it out after a week or more. And so if you're not going to the post office very regularly and you don't have a PO box, you're very likely to lose most of your mail. Also, given the tremendous rurality, if you've spent any time in this region, you're talking very long travel distance for many people. Other studies we've done as a group show that so it's very far to the post office. Those post offices have really inconsistent and limited hours, as well as limited services. Something we know is that the postal employees actually travel from post office to post office. So they're here on Monday, they're there on Tuesday, they're there on Wednesday, right? And so they're not there on a daily basis in most cases, and their hours are something akin to 11 a.m. to 2 p.m., right? So really limited hours. And when we're thinking about Native Americans on reservations, these are some of the poorest individuals in this country. Right. And so, having to drive long distances, assuming you have access to a car, assuming you can pay for gas, especially, think about it these days, right? It's a really high cost of mail access for low income individuals. And so many of them do not get mail on a regular basis. We've also shown in other work that even assuming you can get to the post office, you can post a letter, that we've done a mail experiment in another paper showing that if you send letters from rural locations not on reservations and locations on reservation, the mail is significantly slower and less reliable when you send it on a reservation than when you send it in other rural locations. And we want to emphasize too that slow mail really matters in Arizona, and unreliable mail really matters in Arizona, because in order for a ballot to count in Arizona, it must be received by election day, not postmarked. Right. So if you mail your letter a week before the election, you need to make sure it needs to be received. And we showed that, sometimes you can have mail, even first class mail, we sent in this mail experiment, may not be received for, 10 days after, or not received at all. Okay, so to give an idea of the post office, this is actually a full service post office in Tiknos Pas. Please correct my Arizona, but you can see with the point is here. These are really rural locations, right? And this is actually one of the higher service post offices we see in our sample. But you can see these are not metropolises with a lot of people living around them, right? It's a long way to go to the post office. And what we see, as I'm going to describe in a second, is that most mail access is not in these full service post offices. It's in what was Navajo trading posts and are now, Jiffy Marts and other things like that, general store type access. So these are not the sort of full service post offices that we see commonly. I mean, I live near at least 3 large full service post offices. And so what we see then is that there's really differential access to mail based on whether you have a voting precinct that is on reservation versus off reservation. So we just, summary statistics on the retail hours of the post office per capita on reservation is, or off reservation, I should say, is more than 3 times better in terms of retail hours per capita. In terms of PO box hours per capita, it's close to 10 times better off reservation than on. Again, these are all rural locations that we're comparing it to. The pop density weighted retail hours are close to 10 times higher off reservation, as well as the population density weighted PO box hours to access your mail and PO boxes is twice as good off reservation than on reservation. So this is all to say that it's harder to access the mail even if you're able to get to the post office if you're on reservation. And so in terms of post office, we see the Postal Service and state building, right, as a bigger story of the U.S. West. And mail service was critical to extending the spatial reach, especially of the federal government in the West. So mail service in the West initially followed the military buildup around the Mexican-American War, and later the military campaign to pacify Native people, especially in Arizona. And mail service was a critical economic engine for the region. So providing supplies from the east to support things like farming, as well as trading outward. And really important in Arizona too was tourism, right? So the placement of post offices also had to do with things like the Grand Canyon and where people, where people from other parts of the country would come in to access Arizona. And so as far as locating post office in Arizona, there are kind of 4 main justifications. One was military outposts. A good example of this is Fort Defiance. That was specifically about pacifying the Navajo. as well as trading posts for white settlement. This is the most common location for post offices. And the historical analysis we do show that it's with groups of largely Mormon settlers that came to Northeast Arizona to develop agriculture. Many of these agricultural settlements were failures, right? If you've been to Northeastern Arizona, you might understand, right? It's not the most fertile land for cultivation. And so many of them failed, and along with them, post offices went away, right? So you can see in our appendix and other things that we see a lot of post offices come in, in the early 1900s, late 1800s, and fall away as those agricultural communities were unsuccessful. So then they developed these trading posts for economic services. Some of those trading posts were developed on reservations. And in order to get a trading post on a reservation, you had to get a concession by the Department of the Interior / the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And these were typically given or exclusively given to white settlers on a reservation to serve mail at trading posts. And trading posts did other things as well. Two other reasons: railroads, right? As railroads came through Arizona, so many of the longstanding post offices you see in this part of Arizona were on rail routes. These were typically full service post offices, and these were ones that lasted past 1920, as well as tourist destinations. The Grand Canyon being a good one. A visualization of a Navajo trading post, right? So it was, it was a store, it was, a meeting place. It was also a post office. And also, you get the hint that it's rural. Okay, so as a side note that I think is not necessarily so critical to our particular analysis, but is something to keep in mind when thinking about mail access for Native people in Arizona, is that trading posts which was really wrapped up with mail service in northeastern Arizona, was also the site of significant exploitation of Native people. And so trading posts were. So after forced relocations and transformations of farming, many Native people were relying on government programs, especially Social Security, welfare programs such as unemployment and others. And the trading posts were where people got their checks, right, for their government checks once they no longer had a lot of economic opportunity in their area. And so the trading posts in particular were in not all, but in some cases engaged in exploitative credit schemes. So withholding checks, requiring individuals to take scrip to be able to use the trading post exclusively, withholding information and materials necessary for employment, right? So not allowing mail to come in, sort of metering mail based on the need to kind of keep a monopoly essentially to Native customers. Okay, so in the next few slides, we're going to talk about post of access and voting outcomes. So all of this lead up in terms of where they located post offices, they're much less on reservations than off. The reasons why they did it, and the reasons were not about voting equity or even mail equity. We're going to show in the next couple of slides that that we think that the access to the post office, and we think we can show the access to the post office affects voting outcomes, especially vote by mail outcomes. We know that there's lower turnout for Native people and Native Americans on reservations. That's well established in other literature, and we can show it as well. But we're really going to focus on whether Native people whether people on reservations are voting by mail at the same rates as others off reservation. So we're going to show how the legacy of these postal locations led to unequal access to postal services for individuals on reservations, even in comparison to rural places not on reservations. Actually, rural places not on reservations in northeastern Arizona vote disproportionately overall and vote at higher rates than urban places, and they vote at higher rates of vote by mail than do urban places, but only the precincts that are not on reservations. The distance to the post office is greater and the hours of operation are fewer, right? So we've already shown that. The distance to the polls is greater and fewer drop boxes and polls are provided on a reservation. So it's not as if you don't have access to mail, you have better access to voting by other means, right? So the access to voting by other means is also less on reservations. And rates of vote by mail are significantly lower on reservation precincts, even compared to other highly rural precincts. And to show, I'll breeze through this one, but all of this is to throw out you the idea that, in every regard, the people on reservations have less access to voting, whether it be by mail or whether it be by in person, right? So there are fewer post offices per square mile. The precincts are bigger on reservations. The precincts have fewer post offices on reservation than off. There are fewer drop boxes in general. There are few, both as a percentage of per capita basis as well as on a land basis. And then there are fewer polling locations, and they're more spread apart on reservations than not. Something that's important is we break out Coconino County. Coconino County has the city of Flagstaff, which is really the only urban location in our sample, and we break that out to show that what it says to really compare apples to apples in terms of rural locations. Okay, and so even if we look at vote turnout differentials on reservations, right? So all of these precincts are on reservations. We can see differences based on whether they have access to mail, good access to mail-in versus not. And so at the top we have low mail precincts, and at the bottom we have relatively high mail precincts. And I wouldn't call them objectively high access to mail precincts. They're just relatively high compared to others on reservations. And we can see that, generally speaking, there's higher turnout and higher vote by mail where those reservations have better access to mail. And then, just to give you the lay of the land in terms of turnout and mail voting on and off reservations. So if we see turnout in 2016 and 2020. The turnout off reservation is much higher than on reservation. That's true in 2016. It's true in 2020, right? And you can see that the rate of turnout off reservation in both elections is really high, and significantly higher than we see in urban locations, and certainly significantly higher than we see on reservation. But then we're going to see that the vote by mail share is also much higher off reservation, including, this is important to remember in 2020, when vote by mail was considered, a bad technology for many conservative voters. And it's the rate of conservative voting or Republican voting off reservation in these rural counties is very, very high. So you're having people use a technology that was favored by Democrats and disfavored by Republicans, and you see the off-reservation communities using this disproportionately and at much higher rates than you see on reservation. And very quickly, I know I'm out of time. You can see, and the results of our analysis both show that on reservation precincts have much lower vote by mail rates, controlling for county fixed effects, controlling for turnout rates, et cetera. And then something that's not in the paper, but also shows the same thing is, when reservations have better access to the post office, they vote by mail at higher rates, right? That's what we see here in the interaction analysis. And I'm out of time, so I'll really say that our concluding thoughts are to post offices, which are typically considered a relatively progressive government agency because they provide rural redistribution, and it has majority minority staffing. There are also sites of inequity based on the stickiness of history and continued disparities in things like hours and services. And this is important because post offices are really critical, especially for rural people, especially for older people and those in poor health. And Native people are rural and older and poor health based on socioeconomic factors. And so inequitable access to mail service is a voting rights issue as we see it in the US. And with that, I will finish. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. So we have two discussants. Brian Leonard from Arizona State will take the first two papers, and Tessa Probbins from the University of Pittsburgh will take the Claremont paper.
Well, thank you, Jeff, for inviting me to discuss two papers that are, near and dear to the things that I find most interesting and work on a lot. So it was a real pleasure to get to read both of these papers. I'll go ahead and take them in the order in which they were presented and try to time myself and spend 10 minutes on each paper. So first, thinking about the Spanish mission legacy on Native American reservations by I'll call him Alston number 1 et al. So the research question in this paper is quite clear, right? What are the long run effects of, I'm going to say, historical exposure to Spanish missions during 16th, 17th, or I guess 17th, 18th century for Native Americans later in time, specifically early in the 20th century? So to quickly summarize the paper before getting into some comments, thought this provided a really nice and rich institutional history of Spanish and Native American interactions in the U.S. Southwest. So there's been kind of an explosion of work on within economic history on Native Americans in the last few years, but I think this paper brings something new and fresh and unique by turning the clock back even further, right? So most of what's been done in the last few years by myself and others has really focused on sort of U.S. federal government policy during various eras, and so it's really nice to see something that looks even further back that I think could change the way we think about some of the more modern U.S. policies. So I thought that was really nice. And to do that, it builds on this growing understanding that we have in history more broadly of the persistence of Spanish institutions in this region. And some of the authors on the paper have worked on kind of the legacy of Spanish land and water grants and other things like that throughout the American Southwest and California. So I think it's nice to kind of bring those two literatures together. And in doing that, it combines several really nice data sets to explore a variety of outcomes, although I do have some possible suggestions for improvement there. And another thing that I really appreciated about the paper is I thought it had a really nice discussion of kind of the potential mechanisms through which the specific institutions that you would find on these missions, so exposure to Spanish and Catholic institutions, could affect the specific outcomes that the authors look at in the paper. And again, I have a couple of suggestions for other outcomes to look at. So in terms of thinking about comments, there's kind of three big picture comments I want to make. One is about kind of the way the data are constructed. One is about sort of potential omitted variables, or maybe better to call it selection problems. And then finally, I have a couple comments about perhaps how to think about or measure persistence in a slightly different way. So currently what the paper does, as Lee described, is it's going to aggregate from the reservation level to the superintendency level, or sometimes we call them agency level, where there's often several reservations within a given superintendency or agency. Lee stressed that there's a lot of that these reservations are relatively homogeneous within a given superintendency. But I still found myself asking why would you want to do this? Why aggregate if you can do reservation level data? There's likely going to be some more variation between reservations, right? And importantly, you'll get a larger sample size, which I think is important. So my reading of these data, particularly kind of the outcome data in the early 20th century, is if they don't already exist at the reservation level, they can sort of be allocated to the reservation level because it might be like by tribe, by agency or something like that. So I really found myself asking why aggregate if you don't have to? And so perhaps it's the case that sort of the treatment data or the data on mission experience is aggregated to the superintendency level, in which case, fair enough. But I would encourage the authors to think about disaggregating the data a little bit. So thinking about omitted variables, and sort of my first omitted variable comment is perhaps more of a comment on selection, but I really worried that some of the outcomes that they're looking at later in time in the early 20th century, specifically thinking about income from agriculture and some outcomes like that, could be related to factors that sort of drove mission exposure in the first place. So to use a really specific example from the paper, the authors discuss how the Tohono O'odham people in southern Arizona had pretty expansive agricultural development before the Spanish ever showed up. And you might worry, or you might imagine that could actually affect the extent to which the Spanish decide to kind of set up shop with a mission in a particular location. And indeed, if you take a look at table A1 in the paper and sort of the related discussion, there's this sense that you see a lot more missions kind of put in place where people were sedentary and less nomadic, and the more nomadic tribes and bands were less likely to have mission exposure. So then you might worry in the results that what we're really seeing is kind of the effect of some of these sort of pre-Spanish differences between tribes, and those things are what are persistent, and that the real mechanism isn't necessarily mission exposure. Luckily, I think there's like a pretty straightforward solution to this, which is to use data from the Ethnographic Atlas, which Christian Dipple, Donna Fair, myself, others have used. And basically, these are a bunch of maps that ethnographers made early in the 20th century, kind of describing sort of different traits of different tribes and bands. You get a lot of variables in this data set, things like whether the band was more nomadic or more sedentary, the extent to which their governance institutions were more centralized or more decentralized, the extent to which they relied on agriculture for their caloric intake, things like this, that I think could be really useful and important kind of control variables to include in the model. Christians digitized a lot of this data. I've worked with these data. I'd be happy to share them. I think that could be a really useful thing to add to the analysis. So the second set of sort of omitted variables I was worried about is things that happened after Spanish arrival. So the first set of things was more what's going on before the Spanish show up. Then I want to think about what's happening after the Spanish show up. And in particular, the authors are measuring outcomes in the early 20th century. And a lot of things happen between when the Spanish leave and when those outcomes get measured. And in particular, there's a lot of things that happen vis-a-vis the US government, where we know there's important variation between tribes. So just to name a few kind of off the top of my head, we could think about the Indian Wars and sort of Indian-white military relations and the effect that that may have had on the particular treaties that could get put in place for different tribes. And we kind of know that matters from some of the literature discussed here. Because we're talking about the US Southwest, I think the discovery of gold and other minerals could be really important because we know that actually affected sort of the timing and extent of reservation formation itself. One thing that I sort of learned after moving to Arizona is that there's some very interesting kind of connections to the Civil War with different southern states and territories. And I wonder the extent to which that could play a role if tribes were involved in that at all. That's a history I don't know particularly well. And then the one that really jumped off the page to me, of course, because I've worked on it a lot, but also just because of the timing of the outcome variables, is the Dawes Act, or the allotment era, which ran from about 1887 to 1934, when the federal government's actively privatizing land on reservations, and all the outcomes are going to be measured right in the middle of this time period. And so minimally, it seems important to kind of control for that variation, but it also struck me, given some of the things Lee was saying about sort of land privatization and the ability and interest in sort of taking land from some of these tribes, to actually look at that allotment as an outcome variable. So just for a couple examples, here's a map of the gold mines that was used by Christian in his paper, and then we also used it in our paper. So you can hardly see it, but there's like these little dots that indicate locations of specific mines, and then you can kind of get like a state level productivity measure. So that might be a helpful thing to measure. This is a 1934 report from the BIA looking specifically at reservations in Arizona, but of course we've got it for California, New Mexico, whatever. That's going to tell you when the reservation was allotted, if it was, and the extent to which it was allotted. So again, these are all things I'd be happy to share. Seem important to control for. In that same report, you also get these variables, which I think could be really handy for the authors. Thinking about the extent to which different types of land are either suitable or actually being used for different types of agricultural land use. So I think that could be a really, really nice thing to look at. And again, be happy to share the information we have on this. Some of these things we have digitized and some of them we have not. And then kind of the last comment that I wanted to make, let's see how I'm doing on time. Perfect. Is that it'd be really nice to sort of try to check in on these outcomes at various points in time to the extent that we can. So the authors are trying to tell a persistent story. And so it'd be nice to see to what extent, are these effects fading over time? Are they constant? We'd probably hope and not see that they're growing, because then we might worry that something else is going on. So to some extent, this can be done with the data they already have, right? Because they've got multiple years, but they're in a pretty tight window. I think some of these outcomes are available as early as 1890. And in fact, I think I might have some of them sitting in a spreadsheet I'd be happy to share. And then I wonder, to what extent could you create kind of modern analogs for some of these things to give us a sense of how things are changing over time? And that might assuage some of the concerns about omitted variables and selection that I mentioned a minute ago. So just to wrap up on this paper, I think this is a really important and really interesting project. I feel really optimistic that actually there's a lot more data that can be brought to bear to kind of strengthen the empirical exercise. And I think along those lines, some additional connection to the existing literature on Native American development, specifically in the context of the empirics, could really, really strengthen the paper. So with that, I'll move on to the other paper, Alston number 2, and Stephen Smith, thinking about state trust lands and natural resource use, specifically in the US Northwest. So the research question in this paper is, did state land grants deter natural resource use? And one of my comments that's embedded in this is, are we more interested in understanding the effect of state land grants relative to sort of lands that were left open to settlement and therefore directly sort of passed to settlers from the federal government, or relative to kind of other forms of land grants, so perhaps railroad land grants? And I'll say more about that in a minute. So as they described, the authors are going to exploit spatially uniform variation in state land grants to explore the economic impact of sort of different ways of disposing of land. And they're going to compare a variety of outcomes on sections 16 and 36 versus all the other sections in a given township. And there's pretty clear evidence, right, that state trust lands tend to be less developed. One thing I really appreciated in this paper, I learned a lot about sort of the, like, I'll call it the prehistory of state land grants. So I've studied these things a lot in the context of the U.S. West, and it was really interesting to learn about kind of the longer history of where state land grants came from and how those things tracked forward. So 3 sort of bins of comments on this paper as well. I want to ask some questions about kind of what is the underlying sort of theoretical test that we're interested in. I have some comments about identifying state land both in the past and today, and then just kind of a handful of nitpicky empirical things. So my big question on this paper was what is the theory? And in particular, why should we expect state lands to be different from other lands that were opened for settlement? And in my head, I could think of sort of 2 stories that sort of came out of the discussion. One is just that these lands at various times and places had a different asking price for various reasons. And so this would lead to what I'm going to call the extensive margin price effect, which is just, if I'm a settler and I show up in Washington, it's more expensive for me to buy land from the state than to buy it from the federal government. So I might be more likely to buy it from the federal government. Okay, so that's one thing that could be going on. The other thing that could be going on is that, different, whether I'm dealing with state A or state B or the federal government or a railroad, there could be different requirements, different rules, different institutions that come to bear on how the land is actually transferred into private ownership, or whether it's transferred into private ownership. And I'll call that the institutional effect. I guess my sense is that, like, the former of those, like the extensive margin price effect, is maybe like not super interesting, because it would just basically tell us that, by forcing states to charge a higher price, less of their land got privatized. And so it's less developed today. But I do think the latter sort of idea of, like, what are these other effects that could be going on? What are the other mechanisms? Could be really interesting, but I think that it needs a little bit more fleshing out. But I think there's a lot of variation in the data that the authors can tease out and explore to try to understand what those institutional effects would be. So related to kind of this first point and the extensive margin price effect gets us into the second point, which is thinking about what is state land kind of today and in the past versus what was in the land grant. So I think the authors can directly tell us how much of what they're finding is driven by what I called the price effect. Which is just that these lands never got privatized. So they got transferred from the federal government to the states, and then the state never sold them. So what you're looking at here is a smattering of kind of random townships in southeastern Washington. So these big squares are townships. These crosshatched things are sections 16 and 36. And then these red squares are sections that are still owned by the state today. So I pulled those from the modern data on the protected areas of the United States. And so what you can kind of see is that there is a fair amount of variation in whether a given piece of land that was initially granted to the state ultimately enters into private ownership. And I guess I should say the white areas are private ownership. So something like this section here was granted to the state and sold into private ownership, whereas let's say this section here was granted to the state and never sold. So it should be pretty easy to kind of overlay the data the authors have already built with kind of the modern pad data and just tell us, like, what share of state lands transferred into private ownership. And that would give us a sense of how important is this extensive margin price effect. And I'll come back to that in a minute. The other sort of data cleaning thing with thinking about what is and isn't state land would involve the BLM/GLO data that I know they're both well versed in. So as they described in the presentation in the paper, right, sometimes the settlers got there first, which means when the State Enabling Act gets passed, there's already somebody who's homesteaded Section 16, in which case it's not ever going to become state land, and the state gets to go pick other land in lieu of that. And the authors can, and I think should, use the GLOW data to identify both of these cases to provide a more precise measure rather than this kind of intent to treat measure Stephen talked about. I think they can precisely identify what was a state land grant and what was not. And so the first piece of that is to just go through and find all of the sections that have some other kind of patent on them. And that's very easy to do. You can match about 99% of the patents down to the section level. And so you just go through, find the ones that got settled before a state enabling act. Those things should no longer be called state land in the data. And then the other sort of second pass is a little bit messier, but still quite doable. Played around with it a little bit this morning, would be to go through and find cases where the federal government patented the land to the state and it's specifically labeled as an in lieu section. So these are going to be land grants to the state where they get extra land because some of the sections were already taken and now they're taking it somewhere else. So it's not going to be on 16 or 36. And just looking at some of the authority codes that exist in the data and then like the labeling of the associated law, you can see sort of the Oregon lieu sections coming up here, the Washington in lieu sections coming up here. So this is a thing you could go into the data and kind of clean out. And so I would argue those things should probably just get dropped from the data because right now they're kind of in the comparison group or in the untreated group because they're not 16 or 36, but in reality, they are owned by the state. So it's just sort of a data hygiene thing. A couple other maybe miscellaneous empirical points. So for sure, this spatially arbitrary allocation means that we would expect that sort of the treated and untreated, the state versus non-state lands should be balanced on these various things that they've measured with GIS, but it'd be nice to see a confirmation of that, right? Just to know that whatever effect we're seeing isn't driven by sort of spurious relationships that happen to be there in the data. I'm going to argue you guys should think about using smaller fixed effects, but larger clusters. So definitely the results get sharper when you use those township fixed effects instead of the state fixed effects. And I think you can just sort of exploit the uniform nature of the grid and the way everything's coded up to build smaller fixed effects. So you could divide each township into 4, divide it into 9, even divide it into 16. And so then you're always just comparing adjacent sections. I have the code for doing that. I'd be happy to share it. It's pretty quick, just based on the township identifier and the section number. And then on the flip side of that, I think clustering by township might not be conservative enough. And in particular, what I'm worried about is if you sort of stare at a township, a slight majority of the sections are actually on the edge of the township, so 20 of them, which means one of their neighbors is in a different township. And so if you cluster by township, you're saying I can be correlated with the guys inside of me, but not my next door neighbors on the outside. And so clustering at some higher level, like the county, would get you around that, and I think be a little bit more conservative. And I'm pretty confident that it won't affect your results. And then the final thing is kind of motivated by your other paper on the railroad and spillovers. I think it'd be useful to think about possible spillovers and sort of ask, if I'm a private landowner, so if we're sort of in this world, is it a good thing or a bad thing to be next to state land? Some of my work on inaccessible land would suggest that it's a bad thing. You could think of arguments for why it might be a good thing. But then the other question I wanted to suggest you think about is, to what extent does the effect of state ownership depend on what's around it? And so to motivate that, here's another smattering of random townships from Washington state, where here the gray, rather than being private land, is national forest. And in fact, it kind of looks to me like this land was never actually granted to the state because it's in the middle of some national forest that was declared before the Washington Enabling Act. And so as far as I could tell from reading the paper right now, like this situation is getting treated the same as this situation in the paper. And you could imagine that they might be very, very different. And in fact, you may want to just find these situations and like discard them from the data entirely, depending on what the institutional story you're trying to tell is. So just to wrap up, I think this is a really cool paper with a lot of potential, using handy features of sort of land policy for a nice empirical design. I think some additional thought about the mechanisms might be useful in kind of the framing and the theory. And I want to propose that maybe the test that you're really after here is, what happens to land that is privatized and sort of condition on that. So get rid of everything that's still public today. and sort of ask the question, like, does it matter if I got my land directly from the federal government, or if it went from the federal government to a state to me, or from the federal government to a railroad to me? And that might lead to some cleaner tests. So that's my 20 minutes. So I will be quiet now.
All right. Thank you, Brian. Excellent. And our final discussant is Tessa Province from the University of Pittsburgh, and she is sharing her slides.
Good afternoon from the East Coast here. I really enjoyed this paper. Thanks, Jeff, for inviting me to this, and also just the whole day. I wanted to note, I became aware sort of of this broader project in the fall, and I've actually mentioned it and talked about it in my classes, right? Like the work that that everybody on this project is doing, and I think it's fascinating. To go into some of the initial highlights, and obviously we've just had a conversation about this paper and a wonderful presentation, so I won't belabor this, but this really examines, and they're coming at this from a place in the literature that needs a lot of development right now. It examines the historical origins of Native American participation, particularly focused on voting right now, the impact of sort of the political and economic development on reservations, and that's impacts on representation. And I think in a broader conversation that we're having in the political science literature right now is like, what does vote by mail look like for people? And I think this is an incredibly important conversation. And this puts a really nice sort of focus on the shortcomings of vote by mail, because I think so oftentimes we're focusing on how great vote by mail is. And what we find is like, maybe it's not. In some cases, or at least it's not working to increase access in the way that we think it is for everybody involved. I really learned a lot from this paper in terms of sort of the historical drivers for Native American voting and participation. And the empirics, I have some comments for this, but I think this was a really smart way to do this, exploiting sort of a clear geographical distinction, almost doing sort of a regression discontinuity or a quasi by looking at these distinctions. Thinking of some of the things that just really strike me in this project of being positive is the extensive and in-depth background on post offices and mail service on reservations. I think it's just something we don't know much about. When I became aware of this project in the fall and sort of the broader experiment that it also is a part of this project, it was very eye-opening, right, to many of the things we think about in mail service and how that's developed over time and its impact on communities of color, particularly in the West. Now, I also think this is a fantastic data set. This is the amount of legwork that had to have gone into this is incredibly impressive. And I think that this is going to be really applicable in a lot of other places in studying Indigenous groups. The clarity and transparency of the write-ups and all of the tables and things like that was wonderful. And again, sort of just exploiting this really nice geographic variation in the Southwest. To begin my comments, I think because I enjoy this project so much, I really want to push and see the frame move a little bit in this paper. And I think it could engage in 3 different routes or some mixture of these, but really thinking about broadening it to structural barriers to voting. Again, thinking about the broader literature and all of the work that's being done on this currently. I think Indigenous groups are oftentimes not as big of a part of this conversation. And so really pushing on framing the paper around thinking about those structural barriers and how this is a structural barrier that we're just not considering very often. I know like the Carnegie Institute just did this for individuals who are Indian Americans. There's a lot of work on Latino Americans and Black Americans and thinking about structural barriers to voting, a lot of conversations around this and like voter ID laws right now. But I think that this is sort of the historical origins of mail and postal service and how it's impacting Indigenous groups is important in this conversation. Another route maybe that could really kind of broaden this out is thinking about the manifestations of Indigenous inequality. We know that Indigenous inequality has happened in many ways, and there's a ton of literature on this. And so sort of couching this paper potentially in that frame. And then finally, thinking about maybe looking at this as the causes and consequences of Indigenous participation. There's some new relevant work that's coming out and looking at Indigenous participation, and particularly looking a few projects at the Navajo Reservation and participation. And so that might be another way of thinking about framing some of this work. Just a couple of things as I was going through this paper, I think that given the historical aspects of this paper, that there's a few people in economics. As mentioned sort of before by Brian, right? Tipple, Fair, Fry, Parker, Linda Miller are all people sort of from econ that do some of this historical work. And I think that some of the discussions that they have about government and private choices have deeply impacted, right, contemporary issues that Indigenous people are facing today. So some of that work might be applicable, I think, in this paper to draw on as you're talking about vote by mail. Another thing that I was thinking about is some of the comparative work that's been done in participation in voting in Latin America and Canada, I think would be really helpful here. Again, knowing that this panel and also this paper is focusing on the West, but I think that there are some key lessons learned and thoughts about Indigenous voting and participation from that literature that could be really helpful in sort of fleshing out some of these ideas and providing justification for the paper and why is this important? Why are people working on this? Going into the context and sort of theory, I'd love to push you all more towards thinking about theory on this, because there's a lot of this background information, but really sort of developing some very clear expectations that you're testing in this paper. And I think that that's something that can be really easily done with what you have here. One of the things that I think conceptually could help this paper is that there's a lot of other things woven into the mail service. You were talking during your presentation, right, about the railroad service, about military bases. And I think there's connections to other key aspects that this has that's impacting reservation life that also, as we can see in the literature, might impact people's propensity to vote. Things like the Navajo Nation is known as being a food desert. There's, I believe, 13 grocery stores, even though it's the size of 3 northeastern states. Thinking about as housing, education, and healthcare access, this is a lot of stuff that we see not just for being able to get access to a post office, but being able to access what we might consider basic amenities that are lacking on reservations, and how that impacts Indigenous people's ability to not only vote, but their ability to sort of think about voting and caring about voting when there's so many other access issues that are going on reservations right now, and historically. The other is thinking about trends in Native American participation. And I know that Jean has been a big part of developing this literature in political science. And I guess what I was thinking about throughout this is there's such a clear focus, and it makes sense for this panel and that for this paper on the West. But I think that thinking about participation within and between tribes, and thinking not just about voting participation, but we've seen other Indigenous groups navigate politically through different forms of participation that isn't just voting, thinking about protest, right? Particularly in the last 5 or 10 years, even longer than that. But and there's other ways that we might be observing participation that this isn't sort of telling the whole story for. The other thing is thinking about voting participation, particularly between tribes. So there's different rates of participation across tribes. And this will go into my next set of comments sort of in the empirics and thinking about how you can compare this and how generalizable this study is to other tribes and what it's really telling us about Indigenous people in the US. And then I was thinking through, the last thing is sort of the drivers. And I was trying to get through the mechanism on this. And the explanation in this paper is that there is a clear lack of access to postal services with regard to, having an hour drive or a 3-hour drive to a post office, having to go during certain times, not having sort of traditional addresses. But I'm wondering if there's some alternative mechanisms that you might consider ruling out or discussing conceptually. And the first is thinking about participation in tribal government versus US government. So the Navajo Nation in particular posts their election returns. So I was just looking at these earlier this morning. They have the 2018 election returns, and you can see all of the voting by different areas in the Navajo Nation. And so is it the case that we're seeing Native Americans, particularly Navajos in this case, right, participating in tribal government and just not US elections, right? So like, is it that there is a difference there? And I think that could really show a stark difference is like, is a lack of access to voting in US elections driving this versus a lack of participation across sort of all potential elections that they might be participating in? The next is thinking and putting on my reviewer 2 cap, I apologize in this, is this a lack of access or a lack of efficacy, right? And really disentangling this. And I have a couple of ideas in my next slide in empirics and sort of thinking about this. Is it the case that all of these other things that are going on reservations, thinking about housing, education, healthcare, food access, and is it really the case that access is driving this for Indigenous people, or whether or not there's differences in political efficacy between Indigenous people due to these other structural barriers that they have moving forward? And you talk about this in the paper about the costs of voting. And so I think that could sort of nicely fit in there, even if you can't directly test it. Thinking about the design and the empirics, I absolutely love this data. And I know that this project really closely correlates with the male experiment that y'all have. And and thinking about sort of the observational study that goes along with this. One of the things that was striking is I think sometimes it's hard for individuals who don't study this to conceptualize what these areas look like. And so a map of the areas that you're looking at just initially in the paper, I think could be really helpful and sort of helping people think about this area. And again, sort of these allusions to the Navajo Nation being the size of 3 other larger than 3 other US states. The next thing is as I read this paper and I think about this, I wonder if you could give a sense of awareness about this issue on reservations. Maybe, Indian country, I didn't look for this, but like, does Indian country have an article about this? Are governments talking about the lack of postal services that are available on tribal nations? What does sort of voting, are tribes really pushing members to vote? Are there other organizations, non-governmental organizations that are really pushing people to vote and giving access? And then also from your presentation, it got me thinking about, are churches playing a role in sort of driving voters? Are we seeing, for instance, right, a church renting a bus that can go to polling stations for its congregants? And is there sort of a disproportionate religious aspect to this? It's just something that popped into my head for this. thinking about ruling out some of the alternative explanations that I was talking about on the previous slide, I think there's a couple of ways to do this, and I always hate to say go get more data. So please take these comments with a grain of salt. But I think that a potentially stronger test of the mechanism that you're looking at, which is whether or not postal services that are on reservations versus off reservations are driving this difference in access to voting and voting by mail particularly, would be to see whether or not Native Americans that live on and off reservations have different propensities to vote. So this data is much harder to get, but thinking about maybe ways that you could show that for different sort of on and off reservation areas in your study, I think could really supplement and deal with this issue, particularly of like, is this an Indigenous advocacy issue? Is this about mail by voting, other structural barriers, etc.? The second is, I think that in this paper, it has really clear sort of internal validity, and it left me thinking about sort of Indigenous nations across the US and how they vary so much. So I think that one way that you could look at this, and again, I preface this with like, I hate when somebody tells me to go collect more data, but could really strengthen this paper, is thinking about reservations in the plains, the Southeast, the Northeast, and you could really get at sort of this urban-rural divide by being able to bring in a tribe that is in a other rural area that doesn't have mail-by voting, and looking at their participation rates, and looking at a tribe that's near an urban area and looking at their mail-by voting participation rates. The two last things on this. Going on that, what about other tribes thinking about population size, reservation size, and economic development? The Navajo Nation is one of the largest, not only with regard to reservation size, but population size. How does this look for smaller tribes? And also, thinking about the number of tribes that are in Oklahoma and their influence in sort of government and how that might play out. And thinking about how this might generalize out, or whether or not there's some specific caveats that you need to put in this empirical analysis and the discussion of it about the generalizability. Last thing is, there's some really cool results here. I would actually love to see this broken out by county with substantive effects plots. I think it could tell a really great story here. I know I'm close on time. So for conclusions, I won't belabor on this anymore, but thinking about generalizability to other Indigenous groups, because I think this paper could actually, the reason why I say this is have such an impact, right, and how we're studying this. I'd love to see a discussion in the concluding thoughts about this, about the similarities and differences between other communities of color and communities that have differences in economic development, because I think that's an important part of this story. Is this Indigenous groups? Is this reservations? Or is this a subset of the broader context? And thinking about drawing on the work that looks at differences in the number of polling places and distance of polling places for communities of color, right? And making some connections to that. And then finally, a little bit more of the discussion of sort of these historical and structural inequalities and how they're impacting contemporary inequality for Indigenous groups. And then finally, just a totally minor comment. I think that these tables show a lot. Your appendix tables show a ton of data. I want this, but also they might not be totally necessary as you're moving this paper in for publication. And then just a minor thing, this could be of just my reading of the tables, but I think you're missing a 4A in there. But I really enjoyed this paper. I really enjoyed the broader project on this, the vote by mail experiment and this. So I'm really happy that I got to read another aspect of this project.
Thank you, Tessa. So we have I put in a big gap between this and the book discussion at 1:00. So if we go over the 12:25, that's perfectly fine. But let me give the authors, the paper givers, a chance to respond if they choose. Lee, in your group.
Okay, so I really want to thank Brian for the extensive comments and thorough reading. Yeah, we definitely should disaggregate to the reservation level to the extent we can. I think we can't do it with all the data, but I think it's important to increase the number of observations. We've thought long and hard about this settled agriculture issue. And the problem is there were no tribes in California that practiced settled agriculture. And so we're getting, and almost all in New Mexico did, and a few in Arizona. So we're almost getting, a New Mexico identifier, particularly with all the Pueblo tribes. We have looked at some of the data, but we should go back to it more in the Ethnographic Atlas. We looked at mining and we coded that and put it in, and it didn't have any impact at all on any of our results. We were kind of surprised, but that's what it was. I think it's a great idea to look at allotments and to what extent they occurred on these various reservations. My understanding, at least for the Pueblo tribes, is that they didn't engage in any allotment of lands, but some of the other areas probably did. For persistence, we have toyed around with some data in the 21st century. We don't have data on Catholicism. We don't have data on crime. As I recollect, the data on education showed similar results, that it was no effect, and income was a little bit mixed. So we don't have full blood, so we can get persistence on like two of our measures, and one is there's no impact from the missions on education. I don't know, but so we'll look at the 1890 data as well. But these were extremely helpful set of comments, and I saw that you sent me your slides, and we'll get back to you on how to further the quantitative work. So thanks again.
Thank you. The other Alston and Stephen.
Echo Lee's comments. Thank you for the deep read and the insights. They're always very useful, knowing that you've worked with a lot of this data quite a bit. Thank you for highlighting some things that we knew sort of were lacking. Certainly we knew we needed to get some patent data in there and figure out what actually went out. I was less sort of aware of the current use, the PAD-US, so we really appreciate that. We might be able to trace that through. I think it matters less maybe for that initial irrigation development when a lot of these lands were still open to settlement and it hadn't been sort of locked into federal use during that initial wave, but certainly the CDL data years later might be more relevant. Also, the spatial components, I think, is a really nice insight. In our other work with irrigation, these things are definitely usually beyond a single section. So there is spillover, things that matter. I'm sure you know Eric Luce's paper on sort of these state lands in Wyoming, where he also found some policy spillover with relationship to institutional rules. And then last, I'll just push back a little bit. We are sort of aware of those holes in the national forest, but those didn't start till 1897. So these come subsequent. Now, you're certainly right. There was some sort of land swap. And we know, at least with the railroad grants, there was a prolonged Supreme Court case drawn out to 1940. So we need to figure out what the state was actually doing, because obviously they, in the end, did seem to forgo that land, but they would have initially had it. That's all I had on the empirical side. I don't know if Eric had anything else you wanted to throw in.
Minor comment, I think, that might be particularly relevant for this audience. In all my finance seminars, there's, the strongest shots fired are often, isn't this just a mechanical effect? And so I would agree that, yeah, $10 price per acre versus $2.50 or $1.25 or free with improvements, that's definitely mechanical, but an economically mechanical effect can nonetheless be historically significant in terms of the amount of lands that were ultimately held back by a mechanical economic effect and remained in the hands of the states that ultimately then were subject to considerable judicial interpretation as to the nature of states' obligations under a trust. And so there is a lot of ink spilled about the interpretation of states' obligations with respect to these lands over the course of the 20th century that I definitely didn't have time to get into for the auspices of this particular conversation. But totally agree, and thanks for not just coming out guns blaring, being like, this is just mechanical. I think it is, but I think it also is historically significant.
Okay, thanks. Melissa and the Claremont Group?
Yeah, I'll say two things, two or three things, and then hand it over to my co-authors. So thank you very much for everything, including the citations, which are, into economics, which are really missing, and I noticed that. Other things, the substantive facts is very well received comment, and then generally on the things like efficacy. One thing we were thinking about in terms of making sure this is an issue of access versus equity is really focusing on the vote by mail share as opposed to turnout, right? Because we think that turnout is very much an issue of efficacy, but we're not sure why the vote by mail share would be necessarily different than, differently affected by something like efficacy. It should be something more about equity. But let me hand it over to Jean for any comments.
Thank you, Tessa. Tremendous comments. And my general thought is to try and do this, we're talking about 10 papers. It's like everything imaginable that we need to do. But let me just, they were all good comments. So I'm only going to talk about a couple things because I think they were important things that my hunch is that other people on this symposium may not know about. And in particular, one of the things that you have mentioned at several points, we're making comparisons with both other tribes in terms of participation, in terms of trust, in terms of differences between voting for tribal elections, non-tribal elections, urban versus rural. And I think that was an important piece of your comments that is worth noting. I would recommend, if people have not seen it, is the publication, a very large publication that I worked on, and Joe Dietrich did a bit, where we worked with the NAVRC, Native American Voting Rights Coalition, which involved survey research in four states, Arizona, Nevada, South Dakota, and what am I forgetting? Nevada, Arizona, South Dakota, New Mexico, sorry. And I was part of the folks who did all of the surveys in South Dakota and Nevada. But what we found there was also what the people who did the surveys, this is the largest survey ever done of Native Americans in the United States. And some of the key takeaways were the tremendous difference between people's propensity and willingness to participate politically, not just in voting, but in other forms of participation in terms of tribal governments. We found differences as high as 30 points between their voting for tribal elections versus non-tribal elections. And there were some differences across tribes, but it was very large in all cases. We also found differences between the voting of people on reservations and Native people off reservations. And again, in this case, the off-reservation people were more likely than people on reservations to vote in non-tribal elections. Political trust, which came in to all of this, was dramatically higher for tribal government versus non-tribal. And when we looked at forms of voting, it was fascinating. The area that had the lowest level of trust was voting by mail. It was dramatically lower, but it was particularly lower in states that had had some of the most egregious, I will just use that term, egregious histories of violence towards the Indigenous peoples. So the lowest level of trust was in South Dakota. Yeah. call it the legacy of Wounded Knee, if you would like. So the Tessa's point, or Professor Proven's point, that there are differences across tribes. We found all of that in the NAVRC work and some of the other work. The difference urban and rural held up as well. And I think that's incredibly important. I really liked your comments. I think, as I said, I think it's enough to do probably 10 papers. But in this, the focus on the voting by mail, let me give you an example. One of the things that Lissa mentioned relatively briefly were the difference between the 3 precincts that had the least access to mail and the 3 that had the most access to mail. And interestingly, 2 of those 3, Denehatsu, there's literally and I'm gesturing with my hands that none of you can see, and I don't know why, but there is literally an 870 square mile part of the reservation that does not have a single full service post office. Not one, 870 miles. It has 2 ostensibly what are called postal provider offices, which is non-USPS contracted postal service. And Denehatsu has ostensibly, note my term ostensibly here, 15 hours a week of access. And the other one, which is Mexican Water, has 20. Well, when we were doing the piece that Tessa also mentioned, the experiment where we visited these places and did mail, Denehatsu was closed, even though this was part of that 15 hours when they were supposed to be open. They were closed. And so, it's huge difference. In contrast, the part that has the greatest access, reservation access, is Tuba City. But one of the more which has a full service post office, but even there, its access is less than the ones off reservation. But it's dramatically more. But the Tuba City, the history, Tuba City has a full service post office because it was originally not part of the Navajo Nation. It was originally a Mormon settlement where they were doing missionary work, and they ended up finally, the Mormons being driven out by the Navajo. They burnt some things down and drove them out, but the post office that they had established as a full service post office stayed. So, understanding those differences between the high access, low access, and then understanding the historical roots of that it's a huge, deep dive, and really, really, I think it's really interesting, but wow, there's so much to do. And let me see if my colleague, Joe Deter, has something to add. Joe, do you have anything you want to add?
I'm as you're talking, I'm sending out papers and searching through all my stuff. So no, I don't have, I'm adding it in the comments. We had a couple of papers that reference this trust issue, but actually what I was just typing in the comments is that trust underlie this notion of trust and efficacy and some of the effects that Dr. Provence was talking about. They underlie a lot of the other work, a lot of the other papers that feed. I've been working with Dr. Sherrill on this for 6 years now. She's been working on it for 10, maybe more. And they're all kind of building on each other. Some of the issues that Dr. Provence brought up, we're working on, or that are coming into a paper we're working on now regarding building up some an understanding of whether or not people have access to voting and how do we quantify that. So some of that would come up in that next step of work. We've been sticking to Arizona mostly because we know Arizona, and we've been very familiarized over the last number of years. But one of the goals is to actually start extending some of these ideas and looking at other places as well. So I think we're aware of that. It's just, there's only a few of us, and there's only so many hours in the day. So I think we're aware of this, but as is the common problem I'm sure everybody here faces, how do you get it all done? We have some students who are doing research for us, some undergraduate students over at Scripps. We're looking for more grad students to do it if anybody has volunteers or wants to help. We're always taking free labor. So so I think a lot of these things come up. It's just a matter of how do we address everything all at once. So I think that's everything I have to say about it.
There were a couple of things that came up. I really appreciated our discussant, Brian. That was really the most careful and useful read that I think anyone has given to our paper, and it was really nice. One of the things I wanted to clarify that we have a lot of trouble getting this nuance out, but it's not really a Spanish period versus an American period binary. There's three sections. The Spanish, we're really looking to turn Native Americans into allies through the process of missions. And they guaranteed certain land rights, and they had a communal distribution of output. The Mexicans really undermined that. The Mexican Revolution was about giving darker-skinned people access to power. And the darker-skinned people they helped on the frontier were the military, who were often mulatto or of Native American descent from Mexico. And, as often is the case with helping people move up in the world, this wasn't a case of taking wealth from the wealthy and giving it to the middle. It was a case of giving the brown-skinned military men the right to take Indian land from the missions. And it was a deep and bitter thing, but the Indians were able to live on the land. So when the Americans came in, it was even worse because the Americans really wanted Indians off the land, unless they had been Hispanicized, as Lee said. There were a group of Americans who came in the 1830s, married the local people, converted to Catholicism. Well, you converted first, and then you could marry a daughter of the country and get access to land. So it's really this three-partite system. And, Lee is in New Mexico, where the Spanish and the Mexicans and the Americans all really recognized Pueblo land rights because the Pueblo were agriculturalists of a really tremendous level. I mean, they built these 3-story buildings, and the Spanish were always impressed with that and considered them more civilized. And I think maybe the Americans and the Mexicans did too. They weren't, a big thing for the Spanish system was if you live in community, you're civilized. So the Pueblos already lived in community, whereas, for example, Indians in San Diego really lived in very small bands until the missions came. And even under the missions, they still lived pretty spread out. So, missions would have different outposts. Like one of them was Santa Isabel, which was called an asistencia and has a little church. It was one of the pictures Lee put in. And it's still today a Native American community on a reservation. So anyway, so this issue of whether people are agricultural or not also has a tripartite division, right? Because the Pueblos were certainly agricultural. The San Diego people were not agricultural until the Spanish got there. And then the Tohono O'odham were like agricultural if they lived on the Gila River and less so elsewhere. So then that becomes a little tricky. And I mentioned San Diego because a lot of the modern reservations today that exist in California are in San Diego County. There's only 2 ex-mission reservations in California. There's one among the Chumash near Santa Barbara, and there's one behind Los Angeles in the San Bernardino Mountains. And of course, the American period was really bad. Which I thought, Eric, that was great that you mentioned that, right? Because I think somehow our society doesn't like to mention that. So I guess I had another comment, which was about Eric's paper and your co-author. This issue of, so that the solid land rights of the American period stimulated speculation, right? In the sense that people would buy the land first, knowing that they could install irrigation and make it worth more. So in California, in San Diego County, I'm thinking of, and I think in Arizona too, this often took the form of building land. Well, in San Diego County, it was buying coastal land. So William Heath Davis bought all this land where San Diego is now. And at the time, the problem was there wasn't any potable water there. And so there was this, so after he bought the land, he brought potable drinking water to it. I can't remember if he personally succeeded at this. The first guy failed and then he sold it for cheap and the next guy did succeed. And of course, that's where most of the development is today. But it has this counteracting tendency. So you were saying the solid land rights increases irrigation, but it had this counteracting tendency because a lot of the Indian reservation land in the backcountry was productive under the Spanish, where they had built, pretty minimalist irrigation structures. But I mean, people put a lot of time and effort into that. But then in the American period, where land rights were more solid, the water gets funneled over. Like I read one story of a flume, a wooden flume that carried water right over the Indian reservation to the city of San Diego, and the only place where Native people could cultivate well was where there was a leak in the flume. So I feel like these, because people always, economists, we always say secure property rights are great, but I feel like certainly secure property rights change the trajectory a lot. But it seems like I think this happened in Arizona too. Like the Gila River is not nearly as useful for agriculture as it once was because a lot of the water has been moved out. So I thought about this while we were writing our paper because I was looking into the weeds, but I'd be kind of interesting to hear what you thought about that.
I think you're spot on in the sense that to the extent there are any transaction costs to transferring water rights to later discovered uses that were more optimal or original uses such as those by Native Americans that were more efficient, those are a serious impediment to effective or efficient use of water. I actually just got a grant for a piece examining, the title is Making Water Markets More Liquid, and exploring the extent to which different basins' transaction costs associated with water rights as being appurtenant to the land prevent them from adjusting to weather shocks. And so Stevens and my finding was in Montana, parcels that weren't subject to uncertainty got irrigated earlier. But we were not making an absolute claim about the efficiency of water uses across the US West, because I see the point you're making is early settlement patterns, especially ones that were non-Native American, probably got water in ways that disenfranchised Native Americans, very similar to some of the narratives we've heard today. And so definitely wasn't trying to make an absolute claim about the relative efficiency of all water rights initially, let alone in a persistent sense in a contemporary way.
Great second panel, really great discussion, really great comments by the discussants. Why don't we open the final book panel at 1:10? And thanks again to everyone, and I'll see you in a little bit.